A thin, metallic tang, like old pennies left too long on the tongue, clung to the air. My breath hitched, a shallow, rattling thing that felt alien in my own chest. I was standing, or perhaps floating, in a dim hospital hallway with no staff, machines quietly breathing. The hum of unseen mechanisms pulsed through the floor, a low, rhythmic thrum against the soles of my feet, a sound that promised life yet felt like the echo of its absence. Fluorescent lights, half dead, flickered with a tired sigh, painting the pale walls in sickly yellow and gray. There were no windows, no doors save for the endless, identical ones stretching into the receding gloom. A stark, unadorned space, colder than any truth, it pressed against me with the weight of forgotten things. I remember thinking, this is not where I belong, just before the sensation dissolved, leaving only the ghost of that metallic taste. The highway unfurled before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the burgeoning green of early summer. My sedan, usually a quiet cocoon, felt small and vulnerable against the vast, indifferent landscape. The city, with its frantic pulse and ceaseless clamor, had receded hours ago, replaced by a quiet that felt less like peace and more like a profound, watchful stillness. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, the memory of that hallway a fleeting chill on my skin. Just a dream, I told myself, the product of too many late nights and the stress of a distant relative's unexpected demise. The old farm. Inherited. The words tasted foreign on my tongue, like an antique coin I couldn't quite identify. I was Grant, a creature of concrete and glass, of logical equations and predictable outcomes. Ancestral lands, rural charm, local folklore, these were quaint notions, the stuff of travel brochures, not the fabric of my life. Yet here I was, drawn by the pull of obligation and, perhaps, a flicker of curiosity about the last vestiges of a lineage I barely knew. The deceased relative, a reclusive elder, had left no will, only a cryptic note about the earth's claim and the unquiet sleep. The county official who'd called me had dismissed it as the ramblings of a solitary mind, and I had agreed, nodding politely over the phone. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to a dirt track swallowed by high, unkempt hedgerows. The car rattled, kicking up dust that powdered the wild grasses. The air thickened, losing its crispness, taking on a heavier, loamier scent, like turned soil mixed with something else, something vaguely acrid. A subtle shift, barely perceptible, yet enough to prickle the fine hairs on my arms. The trees, once sparse and slender, grew denser, their branches interlocking overhead, plunging the track into a premature twilight. Sunlight struggled to penetrate, dappling the path with fractured, hesitant light. Finally, the track opened onto a clearing. And there it was. The farmhouse stood, a stoic sentinel of weathered timber and faded paint, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the fields. It was smaller than I'd imagined, more hunched, as if perpetually braced against an unseen wind. The barn, a collapsing hulk of red, leaned precariously beside it, its roof a patchwork of missing shingles. I cut the engine, and the sudden silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered the last echoes of the city. No birdsong. No distant hum of machinery. It wasn't the idyllic picture postcard I might have subconsciously hoped for. It was raw, untamed, and deeply, profoundly quiet. Stepping out, the earth beneath my feet felt strangely soft, almost spongy. The air, heavy with that peculiar scent, seemed to press in on me, a physical presence. I surveyed the fields surrounding the house. Most were overgrown with weeds, but one section, closest to the barn, had clearly been tended recently. Or, rather, attempted to be tended. A wave of unease, cool and unsettling, washed over me. The crops there, what looked like young cornstalks, were a sickly, mottled yellow, their leaves shriveled and brittle. They stood at odd angles, some bent double as if snapped by an invisible force, others merely limp and translucent. It wasn't just blight, it was a deeper, more insidious decay. I knelt, brushing aside a clump of dry stalks. It was a peculiar, almost purplish black, and from its depths emanated that same acrid smell, stronger now, clinging to my nostrils. Or some kind of neglected pest. I was a man of reason, of empirical observation. There had to be a logical explanation. The deceased relative had been old, frail. Perhaps he hadn't been up to the task of maintaining the land. Yet, as I stood there, a prickle ran down my spine. It was the distinct impression that the land itself was not merely neglected, but hungry. And it was watching me. The metallic tang, sharp as a rusted blade, still clung to my tongue, a phantom taste in the sudden, jarring quiet. My chest, which had been a shallow, rattling cage, now expanded with a deep, shuddering breath. The dimness around me dissolved, not into light, but into the familiar, dust-mode dance of morning sun slicing through the grimy windowpanes of my ancestral farm kitchen. It had been a dream, then. A vivid, unsettling dream, born perhaps of the stress of relocation and the sheer quiet of this isolated place. Dismissing the lingering unease, I plunged into the day's tasks with a determined fervor. The farm demanded attention, and I was eager to provide it. For weeks, I had been a whirlwind of activity, repairing crumbling fences, scrubbing generations of grime from the floorboards, and painting the kitchen a hopeful, pale yellow. Each swing of the hammer, each stroke of the brush, was a defiant assertion against the whispers of folklore I'd overheard from the few locals I'd met. Yet, the farm seemed to possess a will of its own, subtly resisting my efforts, or perhaps, simply observing them with a patient, predatory stillness. The first signs were minor, easily rationalized. The heirloom tomatoes, robust just days before, began to shrivel from the bottom up, their leaves curling inward like dying insects. I attributed it to poor soil drainage, a late blight, anything but the unsettling truth that was beginning to prickle at the edges of my composure. Then, the blight spread. It wasn't just the tomatoes. The corn, which had stood tall and proud, its tassels a vibrant green, began to yellow and brown with alarming speed. A faint, sickening sweetness, like fermenting decay, began to rise from the fields, clinging to the morning mist. There was no pest, no visible fungus, no logical explanation for the swift, pervasive death that gripped the crops. It was as if the very life was being drawn out, sucked into the soil itself. The livestock, too, began to show unsettling changes. My small flock of chickens, usually a clucking, scratching flurry of activity, grew listless. They huddled together in the coop, their eyes glassy, their combs a pale, unhealthy blue. One morning, I found a hen pecking frantically at its own feathers, tearing out clumps of down until patches of raw, red skin were exposed. The cattle, a handful of sturdy heifers I'd bought from a neighboring farmer, started to low with a deep, mournful sound, not the usual contented rumble. They would stand for hours at the edge of the pasture, staring fixedly at the ground, their bodies trembling faintly, as if listening to something I could not hear. Their milk, once creamy and abundant, then to a watery, yellowish fluid with a strange, sour aftertaste, and the sounds. Oh, the sounds! They began subtly, at first, easily mistaken for the old house settling, or the wind playing tricks on the ancient timbers. A low, rhythmic thrumming, like a vast, slow heartbeat, seemed to emanate from deep within the earth itself. It was most noticeable at night, when the farmhouse creaked and groaned around me, and the world outside fell silent. Sometimes, it was accompanied by a faint, grating noise, a rasping, as if something enormous was dragging itself across rough stone, far below my feet. I would press my ear to the floorboards, my breath held tight, trying to pinpoint its origin, but it always seemed to shift, a presence just beyond my grasp. The earth grows hungry, Grant, the old shopkeeper had said, his gaze unsettlingly direct as I paid for a sack of feed. Nothing a little hard work can't fix. But her eyes had not wavered. Hard work won't fill that kind of hunger. The words echoed in my mind later that day as I stared out at the dying fields, the sweet stench of decay thick in the air. My rational facade, once so solid, was beginning to crack, thin fissures appearing in the polished surface. He'd stood among the listless animals, his face grim, and simply shook his head. "The blight comes for what's owed," he'd mumbled, his voice rough, before climbing back into his truck and driving away without another word. They spoke of something deeper, something ancient and malevolent, stirring beneath the very ground I stood upon. That night, the thrumming from below was louder, more insistent, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards and into my bed. The farmer from whom I'd bought the heifers, a man of few words, had simply shaken his head, his gaze fixed on the wilting corn beyond my porch. "Some things," he'd rasped, "ain't meant for reason." His silence, heavier than any pronouncement, had burrowed deep into my bones, a cold seed of doubt. That night, the air in my ancestral home felt dense, cloying, as if the very walls were exhaling a stale, forgotten breath. The sweet stench of decay, a persistent phantom from the dying fields, clung to the curtains, seeped into the old timber. I tried to dismiss it, to attribute the unease to stress, to the financial drain of a failing farm, but the feeling was more primal, a gnawing certainty that something ancient and ravenous stirred beneath the topsoil. Sleep offered no respite. My dreams became a churning mire of dark earth and grasping roots, of cattle lowing in an unseen pen, their eyes reflecting a cold, hungry gleam. The sterile scent of antiseptic was a jarring counterpoint to the farm's pervasive rot. The rhythmic hum of unseen mechanisms echoed the frantic pulse in my temples. Then, with a gasp, I was back in my bed, the phantom smell of disinfectant fading, replaced by the familiar, sickening perfume of blight. The morning light, when it finally pierced the gloom of my bedroom, seemed to offer no comfort, only a stark illumination of my growing desperation. I had to find answers, not in the soil, but in the echoes of the past. My great-grandfather, Elias, had been a meticulous record-keeper, a man obsessed with the farm's lineage. I remembered a forgotten study, tucked away in the least-used wing of the house, piled high with dusty ledgers and forgotten texts. The room smelled of parchment and settled dust, a dry, papery scent that scratched at my throat. My fingers, trembling slightly, traced the spines of forgotten volumes, seeking something, anything, that might explain the blight, the unsettling behavior of the livestock, the gnawing sense of being watched. Deep within a locked, iron-bound chest, nestled beneath layers of moth-eaten linens, I found them, a collection of leather-bound journals, their covers scarred and faded, the pages brittle with age. The first bore the elegant, looping script of Elias. The ink, though faded, held a surprising vibrancy, as if the words themselves still pulsed with a desperate energy. His early entries were prosaic, detailing crop yields, weather patterns, the births of animals. But as I turned the pages, a subtle shift in tone began to emerge. The handwriting grew more frantic, the lines less even. Dates became sporadic, sometimes weeks or months between entries, then a flurry of desperate scribbles. Harvest blighted again, one entry read, dated nearly a century ago. The soil, it demands. Not water, not sun. Something deeper. Another, scrawled with a heavy, almost violent hand, the hunger grows. Elias, my grandfather, spoke of it. A pact, he called it. A bargain struck with the earth itself, to ensure bounty, but the cost. The cost swells with each passing season. My breath hitched. A pact. The word resonated with the farmer's cryptic warnings, with the unnerving folklore that had initially amused me. It no longer seemed quaint. It felt like a tightening noose. Elias detailed strange rituals, obscure symbols drawn into the earth before planting, the sacrifice of first fruits, though the phrasing grew increasingly ambiguous, hinting at something far more substantial than grain or livestock. The sense of being observed intensified, not by a physical presence, but by something vast and unseen, a patient intelligence stirring from its slumber. I felt its gaze, heavy and palpable, settle upon me, an ancient hunger recognizing a new morsel. The lineage must feed it. To break the pact is to invite the great blight, to lose all. Better one than all. My great-grandfather, Elias, had had an eldest son who had vanished without a trace, a local mystery never solved. And my own father. I was the eldest, the only son. The deep earth hunger was not just for the land's bounty, it was for the bloodline. And I, Grant, stood at the precipice, the inheritor not just of land, but of a monstrous, generational debt. And it was calling my name. The realization, sharp and cold, had lodged itself beneath my ribs. Elias's lost son, my father's unspoken dread, my own place as the eldest. The farm, once a symbol of inheritance, now felt like a cage, its walls slowly closing in. I could almost hear the earth sighing, a deep, hungry sound that resonated not in my ears, but in the marrow of my bones. The days that followed blurred into a tapestry of mounting unease. Patches of once vibrant corn, stalks heavy with promise, withered overnight, their leaves curling inward like burnt paper. The livestock, once merely agitated, now displayed a profound, unsettling lethargy. The pigs huddled in their pens, their usual boisterous grunts replaced by soft, continuous whimpers. The chickens, usually a flurry of nervous energy, stood still, their eyes glazed, their combs pale. It was as if a great weariness had descended upon them, a slow draining of life force. I consulted agricultural texts, checked the soil, examined the water source. Nothing. The explanations, the scientific remedies, all failed in the face of this pervasive, silent rot. One evening, as twilight bled violet into the sky, I walked out to the old orchard, a place I had always found solace. The gnarled apple trees, their branches like skeletal fingers, usually offered a sense of enduring peace. A low, insistent vibration, like a distant, rumbling stomach. I felt it in my soles, then up my legs, a tremor that seemed to shake my very teeth. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me. The metallic tang intensified, tasting like blood and loam. The trees around me began to sway, not with the wind, for there was none, but with an unseen force that pulled at their roots. A deep groan emanated from the earth, a sound so profound and ancient that it felt less like an audible noise and more like a thought planted directly into my skull. It spoke of hunger, of an insatiable, primordial craving. Then, the ground began to shift. Not a gentle undulation, but a purposeful, sickening heave. It pulled at the grass, at the loose stones, drawing them down into its deepening maw. A young lamb, one of the flock that had wandered too close, bleated once, a pitiful, terrified sound. The lamb was pulled down, slowly, inexorably, its bleating choked off into a gurgle as the earth swallowed it whole. The churning continued for a moment longer, then subsided, leaving behind a smooth, featureless patch of disturbed soil where the lamb had been. No trace. Only the lingering scent of wet earth and something indescribably foul. A scream tore from my throat, raw and ragged, but it was not just my own voice. Hunger. Harvest. Offering. The words coiled around my thoughts, tightening, crushing. I felt a tremendous pressure, a weight settling upon my chest, pushing me down, down into the hungry soil. My vision blurred, the world dissolving into a swirling vortex of black and ochre. I gasped for air, but the scent of decay filled my lungs. It was a sterile, humming quiet, punctuated by the soft, rhythmic sighs of unseen mechanisms. The walls were a pale, sickly green, and the floor shone with a dull, waxed sheen. There was no one here, only the steady, mechanical exhalation and inhalation of the machines, a sound that mimicked a dying breath. It was a place of waiting, of suspended animation, and an echoing emptiness. My own breath hitched in my throat, tasting of dust and the lingering, metallic tang of the orchard. They were clearer now, coalescing into a single, horrifying truth. The blight, the hunger, the ancient pact, it was not merely a folktale, not a natural phenomenon, but the malevolent will of a sentient, ancient being. It had stirred beneath the farm, beneath my very feet, for generations, and now, it was awake. It demanded its due. And I, the eldest, the only son, had been chosen to witness its awakening, perhaps to feed its hunger. The farm was not just a piece of land, it was a hungry maw, and I was standing at its very edge. Elias had tried to break it, and failed. My father had simply endured, or perhaps, surrendered. I would fight. The air in the old house felt thick, heavy with unspoken histories, but beneath the weight, a spark of defiance flickered. The journal, Elias's frantic script, now held a new, terrifying weight. I pored over the entries again, looking for what I had missed, what I had dismissed as the ramblings of a man broken by grief. He wrote of an ancestor, a desperate man in a time of blight, who had made a pact. Not with the devil, not with a demon, but with the earth itself. Or rather, with something within the earth, something primordial that had stirred in the barren soil, demanding more than just water and sun. It demanded life. A gruesome, cyclical bargain, prosperity for the farm, abundance in the fields, in exchange for the eldest son, once every few generations, offered back to the soil. Not a sacrifice on the land, but into it. A feeding. The entity wasn't some distant malevolent spirit, it was woven into the very fabric of this place. It had no name, only a hunger. Elias had called it the deep earth hunger, a phrase that now tasted like ash in my mouth. It explained the sickly livestock, the unnatural vigor of the weeds, the way the crops, though blighted, still seemed to draw life with a perverse tenacity. They were tethered to it, feeding a force that would eventually demand its due from me. The old ledgers, meticulously kept by generations of my ancestors, suddenly made sense. Strange entries forced soil enrichment that involved more than just fertilizer. Unexplained periods of prosperity followed by sudden, mysterious disappearances of male relatives. Elias had written of trying to starve it, to break the cycle by refusing to sow, but the farm had withered in protest, the earth itself seeming to recoil, and then, his son was taken. The pact demanded sustenance, and if not given willingly, it would take. I felt a prickling sensation on my skin, as if 1,000 unseen eyes were watching me from the walls, from the very floorboards. I needed to act, to escape, to find a way to sever this ancient, gruesome bond. My first thought was to call for help, to reach out to the outside world, to the detective who had seemed so dismissive. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. No signal. I walked to the window, then to the porch, peering at the distant, silent fields. Nothing. I tried the landline, the old rotary phone on the kitchen wall. I lifted the receiver. No dial tone, no static, just the sound of my own ragged breath. Panic began to claw at my throat. I raced out to my truck, fumbling with the keys. I tried again, pumping the gas, twisting the key with increasing desperation. The battery was dead. Or perhaps, not just dead. A quick check under the hood revealed the battery cables meticulously, deliberately, severed. The cuts were clean, precise, as if done by a surgical hand, yet the metal was twisted, almost melted at the ends. It wasn't simple vandalism. A wave of nausea washed over me. The farm was no longer just a cage, it was a tomb, and I was being sealed inside. Then, a sudden, disorienting shift. The walls of the old study seemed to ripple, the familiar oak paneling dissolving, replaced by an unfamiliar, sterile cream. The scent of loam and rust vanished, replaced by the faint, antiseptic tang of disinfectant. I saw no one, heard no voice, only the quiet, relentless breath of unseen apparatus. My own reflection, gaunt and terrified, stared back from a polished surface that wasn't there a moment ago. Then, just as quickly, the vision fractured. The antiseptic smell evaporated, the sterile cream walls melted back into the familiar wood. I was back in the study, my heart hammering against my ribs, sweat beading on my forehead. What? My future? A warning? A glimpse into the horror it could inflict on my mind? The psychological torment was beginning. The entity wasn't just physical, it could touch my thoughts, bend my perception. I was isolated, my escape routes severed, my mind already under siege. But the truth, however horrifying, was now mine. I knew what I faced. And with that knowledge, a desperate, fragile seed of a plan began to form, even as the walls of my prison seemed to press in, tighter and tighter. The world had narrowed to a long, pale corridor, the air thick with the metallic tang of something sterilized and the faint, sweet decay of dust. Their rhythmic hum, a soft sigh and click, was the only pulse in this desolate artery of silence. My own breath hitched, ragged and shallow, catching in a throat suddenly dry as parchment. How I had come to be here, I could not recall, only the crushing weight of the farm, the chilling echo of generations, had driven me into this strange, liminal space. The walls, a faint institutional green, stretched into a vanishing point that seemed to recede with my every glance. It wasn't the machines, this was different, deeper, resonating in the marrow. My head swam, and the hallway itself seemed to ripple, the green walls blurring into a viscous, earth brown. The scent of damp soil and something else, something cloying and ancient, filled my nostrils, eclipsing the sterile tang. Then, a vision, sharp and brutal, tore through the fragile fabric of my reality. I was no longer in the hallway, yet I was. And in their hands, offerings. Not grain, not livestock, but something far more precious, far more terrible. A voice, not heard but felt, reverberated through my very being, a rumble from the deep earth itself. The pact. The earth hungers. The blight. The boy, Elias's lost son, my mind screamed. His small hand clutched a wooden toy, a carved bird, its wings broken. He didn't cry. His eyes, wide and unseeing, reflected the same terrible understanding I now felt. The earth swallowed him whole, and a verdant flush, vibrant and unnatural, erupted across the barren fields in the vision, a grotesque feast for the eyes. Then, the scene shifted, dissolving and reforming with sickening speed. My father, younger, his face etched with a familiar despair, stood at the precipice. Beside him, a figure I dimly recognized as his elder brother, a man I had only ever seen in faded photographs. The elder brother, my uncle, his gaze distant, resigned. He stepped forward, not pushed, but drawn by an unseen, undeniable force. The earth consumed him, and the land, parched and cracked moments before, drank deep, its thirst momentarily sated. The eldest. The first fruit. A life for the land. A blood debt. Unbroken. An arm of flesh and bone, pulling something down. The arm had a scar, a small, crescent moon on the wrist, identical to one I bore. My breath caught, a gasp that clawed at my lungs. Elias's lost son. My father's elder brother. The eldest of each generation. And I, the eldest son of my father's line, the current heir to this cursed land, or the crescent scar. The machines still breathed, but their rhythm was now a mocking countdown. The deep. Earth hunger, the harvest blight, they were not metaphors for crop failure. They were real, insatiable, and they demanded a price paid in flesh and blood. I was the intended offering. The farm was not merely bound by an ancient pact, it was a hungry maw, and I was its next meal. The vision, a jagged shard of ice in the crucible of my mind, dissolved into the cool, damp air. My own wrist throbbed, a phantom ache mirroring the crescent moon scar I knew nestled there, a pale memory on my skin. The arm reaching from the earth, pulling something down, was my own. It had always been my own. The realization was a slow, sickening tide, seeping into every forgotten cranny of my past, illuminating the truth I had so assiduously ignored. I wasn't just an inheritor, I was the inheritor of a damnation. A profound chill, more ancient than the farm's oldest timber, settled upon me. My breath hitched. I found myself in a place I hadn't known existed, a low-ceilinged passage beneath the very foundations of the farmhouse. These were rusted contraptions of forgotten purpose, their dials faded, their pipes snaking into the earth. They hummed with a low, persistent thrum, a sound like a vast, unseen lung drawing in and expelling the foul air. The walls, once plastered, now wept dark streaks of moisture, revealing the rough-hewn stone beneath. This wasn't a place for healing, it was a place for waiting. My feet, heavy as lead, carried me forward. The breathing of the machines grew louder, more insistent, a rhythmic pulse that began to synchronize with the frantic beat of my own heart. It was a pressure, a vast, patient malevolence that had always been here, a slumbering predator now fully roused. Then I saw it. At the end of the passage, where the machines converged like a tangle of starved vines, a circular opening gaped in the floor. Not a well, not a pit, but a maw. From its depths rose a miasma of earthy decay, thick and cloying, carrying the faint, sweet tang of something once alive, now utterly consumed. The air around the maw shimmered, not with heat, but with a palpable presence, a vast emptiness that yearned to be filled. Around the edge of the opening, arrayed in a macabre tableau, were the remnants of the harvest blight. Not just withered stalks, but the desiccated carcasses of small animals, a field mouse, a sparrow, a skeletal rabbit, all reduced to brittle husks, their forms twisted in a final, silent scream. This wasn't merely a lack of life, it was an active draining, a siphoning, a preparation. The scar on my wrist burned. The arm from my vision, my arm, reaching out to pull something down. And I, Grant, was the harvest. My family hadn't merely appeased it, they had fed it, generation after generation, offering up their own bloodline to satiate its insatiable hunger. The crescent moon was not a birthmark, it was a brand, a mark of ownership. A low groan emanated from the maw, a sound that was not of air or stone, but of profound, ancient satisfaction. It was ready. It was waiting. My fingers brushed against the rough canvas of my pocket, finding the relic I'd unearthed from the old chest, a tarnished silver sickle, its blade dull with age, yet still sharp enough to cut. It was not a weapon, not against this, but perhaps a key. The folklore spoke of breaking the binding, of severing the root. This sickle, passed down through my cursed lineage, might be the instrument of either my salvation or my final undoing. The floor beneath my feet began to tremble, a slow, rhythmic tremor that escalated into a violent shudder. The machines shrieked now, their breathing turning into a gasping death rattle. The maw on the floor pulsed with an internal light, a deep, resonant crimson that flickered like a dying ember, yet promised an inferno. I had to act. There was no escape, no retreat. The farm, the very soil, was alive with this hunger, and it had me in its grasp. My ancestors had offered themselves, or others, to keep the blight at bay, but I wouldn't. I couldn't. Not like this. With a ragged cry that tore from my throat, I stumbled towards the maw, the sickle clutched tight in my hand. The entity wasn't a beast, it was the earth, the primal, consuming force beneath all life. It was here, and it wanted me. As I reached the edge, the crimson light flared, blinding me for a moment. I raised the sickle, its dull silver catching the hellish glow, a defiant glint in the face of oblivion. My hand, the one bearing the crescent scar, trembled, but my resolve hardened. I would not be another harvest. I would not be pulled down. This was my stand, my final desperate attempt to sever the ancient binding, even if it meant tearing the very world apart around me. The deep earth hunger roared, a silent, internal scream that threatened to shatter my mind. But I met it, not with fear, but with a desperate, primal will to survive. A terrible, grinding sound erupted, as if the world itself cried out in agony. The world, when it returned, was a hushed discord of sterile air and faint, mechanical sighs. I lay on my back, a rough sheet clinging to my skin, and above me, fluorescent panels bled a weak, jaundiced light onto the ceiling tiles. My head throbbed, a dull, persistent metronome against the thin pillow. The rhythmic hiss-click of some unseen apparatus echoed from deeper within the building's quietude, a sound like a tired lung perpetually filling and emptying. My eyes fluttered open, then squeezed shut against the muted glare. The air tasted of antiseptic and something metallic, a faint tang that scraped at the back of my throat. I tried to move, but a leaden weight pressed down on my limbs, binding me to the cot. My body felt alien, a discarded husk. A vague memory, like static on an old television, flickered at the edge of my consciousness, the suffocating grip of black soil, the primal roar that had no sound, only feeling, and the searing pain that had ripped through my arm. I lifted my left hand, the movement slow and arduous. My wrist was bandaged, a thick, white swathe. Beneath it, I knew, lay the crescent moon scar, no longer a phantom ache but a real, fresh wound. My fingers trembled as they traced the edge of the dressing. But what had it pulled? And who was pulling me now? A chill, not of the room's temperature but of memory, snaked through me. I remembered the earth's maw, a gaping wound beneath the withered crops, and the desperate, guttural sound it made as it finally fed. It had taken something. Or perhaps, it had simply taken a part of me. The thought was a cold, sharp blade, twisting in my gut. My family's pact. The ancient hunger. I had dismissed it, laughed at it, until the soil itself had risen to claim its due. I pushed myself up, groaning as protestations rippled through my bruised muscles. My head spun, and the hallway, a long, empty corridor of muted greens and grays, stretched into a vanishing point. There was no one. Not a soul. Only the low hum of distant machines, a testament to life continuing somewhere, while I was left in this limbo. The entity was appeased, for now. The farm was quiet, the blight perhaps lifted from its fields. But at what cost? The truth, stark and unforgiving, settled upon me like a shroud. The arm reaching from the earth, pulling something down, it was mine, yes. But it was also me being pulled. Not into the earth, not fully, but into the lineage, the grim cycle. The sacrifice hadn't been an ending to the pact, but a renewal. I had not merely witnessed the hunger, I had become a link in its chain. The crescent moon scar was not just a wound, it was a brand, a permanent mark of my unwilling participation. I was not a victim, not entirely. I was an agent, a conduit. A shiver ran through me, despite the phantom warmth that now seemed to emanate from my bandaged wrist. The earth's hunger was not sated for good, it was merely dormant. It had tasted, and it remembered. And I remembered its taste, a metallic, earthy tang that now seemed to linger on my tongue, even in this sterile place. My perception of reality, once so solid and predictable, had shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Each movement was a testament to the trauma, a symphony of aches and stiffness. I was alive, yes, but profoundly changed. The farm, my ancestral legacy, was no longer just land, it was a hungry, watchful entity, and I, its inheritor, was now bound to it in a way far deeper and more terrifying than bloodline alone. The quiet hum of the machines in the empty hallway seemed to mock me, a lullaby for a soul forever scarred. I had survived, but survival had stripped me bare, leaving behind a grim understanding. The ancient pact was not broken. It had merely found its next custodian. And I, Grant, was determined to learn its true depths, even if it meant staring into the very maw that had almost claimed me.